Okay, we're going to talk about productivity today for just a little bit. Hopefully, that's a term that you've heard and you've used before. Maybe you've had different definitions, or maybe not had sort of an official definition of productivity. But I think most people kind of know what the term means. First of all, it's a very common metric or key performance indicator. Some companies call them their KPIs. A metric is just a measure of how our business is doing. Productivity is often something when we sort of ask ourselves, how's our business doing, or how is my team doing, or how's my operation doing? You want to know, well, how productive are they? And so we need to know, what do we mean by that? And usually when we talk about productivity from an operation standpoint, what we mean is, what are you getting out compared to what are you putting in? And when we think about out and in, here's a point where we need to think like a manager or like a business owner, and not necessarily like an employee. So from a manager or business owner standpoint, you kind of look at what's going on and saying, what is this company getting out compared to what is putting in to that process? Again, I think it's kind of a common sense term. I think a lot of people use the term. They might have different meanings, and we'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we use the term productivity. There's a phrase that we use, and it's called operational definitions, and that's what an operational definition is. It says, for my company, when I use the term productivity, what do I mean? When I use the term customer service, what exactly am I measuring? When I say we were on time, exactly what are we measuring? We need an operational definition, and you have to be really careful with those. If you are a person that deals with different companies or deals with different locations, you have to really be careful of just hearing two different people say, well, at our company, this site is, we got a 75% productivity level. And then you go to another company and they say, yeah, we're operating at 99% productivity. And if you just take those at face value and you think, wow, that second place is 99% productivity, they must be doing great things. You really need to take a minute and ask yourself, or ask them, what is your measure of productivity? Exactly how do you measure? What's your output divided by what's your input? What are you including and what are you not including? Because you may have two different operations that have vastly different productivity numbers, but you might find that they operate very similarly. It's just that they measure them differently. So we want to talk about operational definitions in every topic that we talk about in this course. And I would say whenever you're communicating with someone in a business environment, you need to make sure you have those operational definitions, that we know what we mean when we use a phrase. So we're talking about productivity today, though. We see it talked about in a lot of different environments. In sports, they talk about quarterbacks being productive with the ball, and that may mean the number of yards you get per play, or the number of completed passes compared to the number of passes that are thrown. Maybe it's a batter, a batter in baseball, when you think about how productive are they. Maybe that's just your hitting average. Certainly in manufacturing, we have talked about productivity for a long time, and we usually think about the number of units produced compared to the number of hours worked, or maybe the number of dollars manufactured compared to the dollars that we put in terms of labor and material and things like that. We might hear people talk about productivity in a farming environment, which might be, how much crops, how many pounds or how many bushels of a product do we get out compared to how many acres that it took us. So whatever environment we're in, when we talk about productivity, just think about, what do I get out compared to what do I put in. And let's see sort of where we go in here. Here's a productivity example from what I call the real world, not just working out of an academic textbook, but something you might be faced with, maybe not in your particular industry. Here's an example, though, that someone's faced with. A company in Atlanta is trying to compare the productivity between producing lamps in-house or outsourcing the same lamps from a factory in Xiamen, China. In Xiamen, an employee is paid $3 per hour and is capable of producing 42 lamps during an 8-hour shift. If an Atlanta employee is capable of producing 15 lamps per hour, what hourly pay rate can the employee make and still have a productivity level equal to the shaman worker. Well, there's a lot of words there and a lot of numbers there and a lot of information there, but that's the kind of situation we get faced with often, is we're trying to compare two different operations, either two different groups of people or two different companies, and really trying to figure out which one is more productive and which one is more efficient. Right off the bat, we kind of see we got some challenges here, that the data we're given is in different units of measure. In Shaman, they tell us they can make 42 lamps during an 8-hour shift, but in Atlanta they tell us how many lamps they make per hour. So those aren't really consistent. We've got to figure out what to do with that. And all they're really asking is, what can you pay the Atlanta employee and be productive with the Shaman employee? So we'll figure out how to do that. But that's kind of where we're headed. We're headed down a road to help us answer questions like this. So businesses compete using operations. When we talk about operations management, that's a core course for the MBA program, which means every student that wants an MBA will take an operations management course. And again, I think that's probably a term that most people are familiar with, operations or operations management. What does it mean for the business? And so we think about businesses can compete with their operations. It's just how we get our work done. You might compete based on your product or your service design, that we offer something that our competitors don't offer. And so we expect customers to come to us because they can't go anywhere else to get the particular product or service that we have. Maybe we compete based on our cost, that we're the low-cost provider. So we have other competitors, and maybe those other competitors do make the same product as we make or offer the same service, but they don't do it as low cost as we do. Maybe it's based on location, that our competitiveness comes just from the fact of where we are located. We're close to the customer, or just that we're in some geographic area that makes it advantageous for us. Maybe it's based on our quality. Customers come to us not because we're the low-cost provider, not necessarily because we're right around the corner, not because we offer a product that's unique and no one else offers it, but because we offer maybe that product at a higher quality level than our competitors do. Maybe it's just quick response. That's why someone uses us, is because we're able to respond to them quicker than our competition is. Maybe it's our level of service, that our customers come to us because we provide better service than our competition does. So that leads us to productivity. Obviously, productivity is going to be a key component to how cost effective we are. Sometimes it is a component of the level of quality and the level of service. But a lot of times people think of productivity, think of cost management. So again, productivity is just a measure of how effective we are at using our resources. And we think about resources from an operational standpoint as the people that we have. Do we use our people's time effectively? Do we use our machines effectively? Do we use our materials effectively? We're usually going to see this as some kind of ratio of output to input, and we got to think like managers think. So when we think of what's the output, you got to think in terms of, if I own this company or if I'm the manager, what am I getting out from this operation? And if I own this company or if I'm the manager, what am I putting into this operation? Productivity ratios used for lots of different things in industry. Certainly for planning workforce requirements. The more productive you are, then the fewer resources you need. But at a minimum, you have to know your productivity level to know, in order to get a certain amount of work done, how many resources do you need for scheduling equipment, for financial analysis. Let's look at what some of these productivity measures, what they might actually look like. We might use a partial measure of productivity. So we might think about, what's our output divided by a single input? And we'll see some examples of that. But when you think about cost, that would certainly make sense of, what do we get out from this system? So maybe we think in terms of, if we're producing blocks, how many blocks do we output for every labor dollar that we input, and that's just a single input, just the labor dollar. Or how many blocks do we output for every dollar that we spend in energy, and that would be a single input. Multi-factor, again, similar. What do we output, but now we start adding multiple inputs to that, and then of course total measures your total output divided by total inputs. Again, productivity we're going to express as outputs divided by inputs. Sometimes you see people try to flip that ratio, and they'll define it as inputs divided by outputs. Your organization may have their own particular definition of what productivity is. They might use the term efficiency. They might use a totally different term. There's not a universal standard term. Sometimes we use the phrase operational definitions to describe that I need to know exactly how you define your metrics, because they're not standard across all industries. And when I say I work at a plant and we had a productivity of 98%, and you say, well, I work at a facility and we have a productivity of 70%, that doesn't necessarily mean that my facility is more productive than yours. We have to make sure we know how each one is measuring productivity. Again, that's operational definitions, and that's one of the first things that I want to know when I go in to take a look at an operation or look at some kind of process is give me operational definitions. Don't just tell me your numbers. So there's a few examples then. Partial measures: output divided by labor, output divided by machine, output divided by capital, output divided by energy. Whatever makes sense in your industry to measure. Multi-factors, you just start adding a couple of things together. Total, we just add everything together. Should be pretty obvious there. So here's some examples. Labor productivity, that's one that many people in your industry focus on because you have a high labor content. Many of your operations have a high labor content, maybe compared to other industries. So your units produced divided by your labor hour. Maybe it's units of output divided by a shift. You talk about that, how many tons per shift, you hear that kind of phrase, or how many pounds per shift, or how many truckloads per shift. Sometimes value added per labor hour, and again I would sort of jump back to that idea of operational definition. Exactly how do you define value added? If we think about just a machine, we could think of the units of output per machine hour. That's a little bit different than a labor hour. When you have machine intensive or machine controlled operations, then sometimes we want to know just what are we getting out of each machine, not necessarily concerned with the labor that goes to tending or feeding that machine. Ideas like capital productivity, units of output per dollar of input, so how much money are we spending on our capital equipment, capital expenditures compared to what we get out. For some of your industries, you have high energy consumption rates, so units of output per kilowatt hour. Again, we can create lots of different definitions, lots of different operational definitions. It's just what's important to your particular industry, in your particular process. What are the cost drivers? What makes your costs go up? Whatever makes your costs go up, that's what I want to measure productivity against. Let's do a simple problem here. Pretty straightforward. 7,040 units produced. In this example, I don't know what a unit is, and I don't know how much a unit costs, so that sort of tells me one thing. I would like more information, but maybe this is the information I have, or this is the information that I need to collect. I make 7,040 units. Cost of the labor to produce those 7,040 units is $1,000. The cost of the material is $520. Cost of overhead is $2,000. We want to know what's the multi-factor productivity. And we could do this as a single factor. I mean, we could figure out the output per labor dollar, or output per material dollar, or output per overhead dollar. But the question asks for the output for a multi-factor. So we just take our output, 7,040 units, and divide by the inputs that were given, labor dollars, material dollars, plus overhead dollars. And we need to make sure that we know what the units of measure are. It's 2 units per dollar of input. And you might say, well, is that good or is that bad? And I don't know. What's a unit worth? How much do we sell a unit for? Certainly this example, we don't know what we sell a unit for, so we don't know whether we're making a profit or a loss. So is this a good measure of productivity? I don't know. What are you trying to figure out from your productivity measure? Am I trying to figure out, is this operation more efficient maybe than another shift? And if I'm looking at this same product, these same units being made on another shift, then this might make sense. 2 units per dollar of input on first shift, 3 units per dollar of input on second shift, or 2 units per dollar of input at one location, 1 unit per dollar of input at another location. So if I'm just trying to compare sort of how much is being done, and if the output is the same, if a unit is the same at location 1 than it is location 2, then I may not have to know the actual dollar value of the unit in order to learn something about my 2 operations. For some of you, the concept of process yield is important, and we'll see what this idea of process yield. Process yield is a ratio of output of good product to input. Defective product is not included in the output. Sometimes folks have a hard time with that when they think about productivity and yield. If I spend time working on a product and then it turns out that the finished good, the final product, is defective and I can't sell it to the customer, then my productivity was 0 in that example, because my output is nothing. I have nothing that I can actually sell to a customer, but I still have input. I still use my time and material. We see process yields in any of these process industries. I did some consulting work for a bakery a couple of months ago, and that was one of their big concerns, was their process yield. It's how many pounds worth of dough do we put, or how many pounds worth of ingredients do we put at the beginning of their operation, and how many pounds of cookies or bread or cake do we get out the other end. And that's a measure of process yield, because there's some losses that go on there. I know a couple old moonshiners, and they talk about process yield. It's how many pounds of corn and sugar and barley do they put in at the front of the operation, and how many gallons of whiskey do they get out the other end of the operation. So it's just a measure of sort of what comes out good compared to what you put in. Maybe service examples. See here, ratio of cars rented to cars available to rent is a process yield. So sort of how many good do I convert? Number of apartments unit rented to units available. Some people might call those utilizations or capacities. So let's go back to the problem that we started with. We had this productivity question for the real world. Again, a company in Atlanta is trying to compare the productivity between producing lamps in-house or outsourcing the same lamp from a factory in Xiamen, China. In Xiamen, an employee is paid $3 an hour and is capable of producing 42 lamps during an 8-hour shift. I think we have all the information that we need for Xiamen. If in Atlanta, an employee is capable of producing 15 lamps per hour, what hourly rate can the employee make and still have a productivity level equal to the Xiamen worker? So obviously we're missing a piece of information from Atlanta. We're missing what their wage rate is. That's what we're being asked to figure out. Okay, so let's see, how do we work a problem like this? We have all the information that we needed for Xiamen, so I think the first thing we want to do is just figure out what's the productivity there. So we know from our formula, productivity is output divided by input. And we think like a manager or like an owner of the company, not like an employee. So we say, what do I get out of this process from the manager or the owner standpoint? And I get 42 lamps out. I don't know the selling price of those lamps. I wish I did. That'd give me a little more information, a little more detailed information about productivity, but I don't, so I use the information I have. I get 42 lamps out, and I think about what do I put into this system, and from a owner or manager standpoint, I have 8 hours of labor and I pay $3 an hour, so there's 24 labor dollars that went in. So do that ratio, and I see that I have 1.75 lamps per dollar of input. That's per labor dollar of input. Then I think about productivity in Atlanta, And the question said, what wage can an Atlanta employee make and still have the same productivity? So I know that I want my Atlanta productivity to be the same as the Shaman productivity. I want it to be 1.75 lamps per dollar of input. And I know that in Atlanta, the employee makes 15 lamps for every 1 hour. So that's my output, 15 lamps. My input is an hour, and I don't know the wage. That's what I'm trying to figure out, right? I got 15 lamps of output. I have 1 hour times some kind of wage, and I need that to equal 1.75 lamps per dollar. So I do a little arrangement of my variables here and solve for the wage, and I get the wage is $8.75 per hour. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Atlanta, but that's not a very good wage. I don't think you can live in Atlanta for $8.57 an hour. So how does Atlanta stay competitive with Shaman? I mean, is that the answer, that you have to pay the employees $8.57 an hour, and that's the only way you can be competitive? Remember, this productivity is a ratio. It's output divided by input. If we want productivity to be higher, it's like a little algebra example here. See if we can remember math from a long time ago. If we want this number, productivity, to go up, we can do two things, right? We could actually lower the input, so that means we can spend less hours producing the same output, or lower the wage. We can't lower the wage any more than this. That's about as low as we can go, right? So the other way to make productivity go up is make the output go up. And I think for many companies today that are competing with foreign suppliers, or even competing with domestic other suppliers, in order to get your productivity up, the answer is that you have to be able to increase your output for the same input. And that's the only good way to get your productivity up. There could be other factors involved here. You might look at this problem and say, well, wait a minute, is the quality the same? And you didn't take into account transportation. I mean, if we're making these lamps in China and we're trying to sell them in the United States, then there's tariffs and duties and taxes and transportation costs. So clearly this was a simple problem with not considering a lot of variables. We're just trying to look at the productivity side. So what kind of things do affect productivity? I mean, why are some operations more productive or more efficient than other operations? Some of that might have to do with capital. So you might look at two different ready mix plants, and you might say, gosh, one is much more productive than the other. Why is that? And maybe it has to do with the capital, with the equipment or the technology that's been installed in a new facility compared to an old facility. And if you're in an old facility, you may just say, we just don't have the kind of capital equipment and the kind of technology that lets us be as productive, have as much output for the same amount of input as another operation. Maybe it has to do with quality. Maybe the quality of the product you're producing can affect your productivity. Certainly there are high-end products that sometimes just take more time and take more resources to produce. Maybe it's the management team, and that's what we find a lot of times is we just sometimes have management teams who are able to get more out of their people than other management teams are. So, whether that's personality or whether that's kind of policy and procedure of just how they run the business. And I think everyone can probably relate to that. You've probably worked in groups or worked for managers that you say, they're just able to get a lot of stuff done. They're just really efficient with how they accomplish tasks. And unfortunately, some of us have worked for people who are on the other end of the spectrum, just seem like it takes a lot of time and a lot of people and a lot of resources to get very little done. And you usually say about them, they're just not very efficient. What else might affect productivity? Things like standardization. We know producing customized products or customized services typically take more time. We're just not as productive or efficient when we're doing different things constantly. And standardization, a lot of companies will say, this is our bread and butter. We supply this one mix or we make this one type of block, or we make this one type of product, or we create one style of drawing, and if it's standardized, we can really crank them out. And, there's things like the learning curve. We get good at figuring out shortcuts. Quality we talked about. Maybe use of the internet. I don't know if that's, I'm not sure if this slide means affecting in a good way or affecting in a bad way. Sometimes we use the internet. Some people are really effective at using the internet to let them be more productive. Some people spend a lot of time on Facebook and Twitter and use the internet, and that makes them less productive. Computer viruses, which is almost like any kind of downtime or maintenance issues, affect your productivity because you're still paying the labor, you're still paying the energy costs, you still have the overhead costs that are going on, and anytime you have some kind of downtime or maintenance problem, those costs are still going on. Again, think like a manager, not like an employee. A manager or an owner says, man, I still got expenses, I'm still inputting to this business, but I'm getting no output. Searching for lost or misplaced items. A lot of times on construction sites, we spend a lot of time wandering around looking for materials or looking for tools. A lot of times we do that in the office too. Sometimes offices are smaller, and so we don't find ourselves wandering quite as far. Sometimes on construction sites, we can spend a lot of time because we have a lot of ground to cover. And when we start talking about Lean and Six Sigma later on in this class, we'll talk about maybe ways to cut down on the amount of time that's spent searching for lost or misplaced items. Scrap rates kind of goes back to that yield. I input energy, time, material into the system, and if what I produce is defective, then I have nothing on the output side. Sometimes new workers affect our productivity. If you work with temporaries or if you bring people in who are inexperienced, often they're not as productive as the seasoned employees. Sometimes not only is it their productivity that drops, it's the productivity of the seasoned employees working beside them, because the experienced employee is spending maybe a significant amount of their time helping the new worker, so you really take a double hit there. Sometimes there are just some things that affect our productivity, and sometimes we sort of take that hit and say it's worth it. Safety might be one of those, and again, it might depend on your operational definition. How do you define productivity? If you have a safety meeting every week, you pay your employees to be there, but they're not producing anything because they're in a safety meeting, then maybe you show that as a loss of productivity during that hour. Maybe your operational definition is that you sort of separate that and you don't include that. Some places would include that, and they might say that's fine. We don't want our productivity to be 100%. We know that we are paying our people some time to work on safety projects or have safety meetings, have communication to talk about safety, and that's worth it to us. In the information technology world, anytime you have a shortage of workers, it can affect your productivity. Sometimes when you just don't have enough hands, it can affect your productivity. Sometimes it's too many cooks spoil the soup, too many people, but sometimes not enough can also affect productivity. Layoffs, or at least the threat of a looming layoff, and again in the construction world, sometimes this is just the nature of the business. You know that a job is coming to a close. The employees know that a job is coming to a close, and they know as you close out that project that some of the jobs are going to be lost, and sometimes you'll see your productivity really take a nosedive because they know that's happening. Any of this idea about labor turnover, so you get new employees in, it often affects your productivity. Just the design of the workspace can affect your productivity from a good way or a bad way. Again, we'll talk about that when we get into Lean systems and Six Sigma. Can I design my workspace to just be more efficient? And I think probably everyone would probably say, yeah, I've worked in places where things were organized well, and it was clear where everything was, and I was more productive in that environment than I am in an environment where things are lost and I don't know where to look for what I'm searching for. Sometimes incentive plans that reward productivity, hopefully those affect productivity, or the incentive plan isn't actually providing an incentive. So there's things we can do that will incentivize people to be more productive. And I think maybe this is an interesting slide for concrete industry management. I think people in the construction world have forever, or for a long time anyway, really dealt with outsourcing. And you don't call it outsourcing. Maybe you call it subcontracting. And you have subs. And we have general contractors who take responsibility for an entire project, but they outsource different functions to subs, and kind of different nomenclature or different terminology, but the same idea. Why would you use a subcontractor and not do the work yourself? Well, maybe it's because you have higher productivity in another company doing a task for you than what your own organization would do itself. One way to reverse that is if you can improve your own productivity, then maybe you don't want to outsource. So, I think maybe the construction world is much more advanced in this kind of thinking. And I look at a job, I realize there's a lot of different things to do, and I have to decide which ones of those things am I going to do with my own employees, and which ones of those tasks am I going to do by subcontracting that to somebody else. And if you're going to do it with your own employees, you need to be productive at it. And if you're not going to be productive at it, you need to find somebody else to do that task for you.
This is kind of a cool application. I thought this was a dredging machine at a Cemex plant down outside of Miami, Florida. And I asked the Cemex executives that were there about the operation and the maintenance of the machine. They said, oh, well, actually, we subcontract both the operation and the maintenance of that dredging machine, even though we're there at a Cemex quarry. And you think about outsourcing and core competencies and what are people good at, and sort of what are they supposed to be good at. And clearly this is an example where running a dredging machine and doing maintenance on it is not their core competency. So they hired an outside firm to perform the maintenance on this machine and operate it on a daily basis. A good example of outsourcing or subcontracting in the industry.
If you do decide that you need to do a task, or you're just trying to look at trying to improve your productivity in your own operation, a couple of steps, and hopefully they make sense, and they're, I would almost say, common sense. But the first thing you need to do when you start having questions about your productivity, and you say, we want to improve our productivity, we want to be more productive, the very first thing you need to do is you need to develop a productivity measure. We need some kind of metric. We need some kind of number that we can all measure and all agree on and all talk about consistently within an organization. So it does no good for me to come into a group of people who are doing a task and say, you guys don't seem like you're very productive. And they say, well, I don't know how you measuring that. And I said, well, I don't really have a measure. I just been kind of watching you, and it seems like you guys are busy, some of the time, but it seems like you're not busy some of the time. That goes nowhere, because we all know that there are people who can be not busy at all, but can make themselves look busy. I mean, we have people who are specialists in doing that. And vice versa, we have people sometimes that just seem like they're running 100 miles an hour nonstop all day, and yet at the end of the day, when we really look at what did you accomplish, it's almost nothing. So just watching people and trying to get a feel for do they look busy doesn't get it. And saying, well, you guys are productive. Well, how productive? Well, I don't know. What's the number? Have we improved? That doesn't get it. We have to have some kind of quantitative metric, some kind of key performance indicator or dashboard measure or metric where we actually measure what's being done compared to what's put in. Then we're going to determine the critical operation. Where is it that we need to improve productivity? It may not be in our entire operation from start to finish. Maybe it's just in one particular step or one particular work group. Then we've got to come up with some methods for improving that productivity, establish reasonable goals for that. Certainly the management team has to be supportive of any kind of efforts that are related to productivity improvement. And then again, we're back to measure. If we didn't have a productivity measure, then we couldn't measure our improvement efforts. So that's one of the reasons that that's the very first step. And then we need to publicize those improvements, let everybody know our success story.